A stove is a stove, no matter where you go.
A patty is a patty, that's what I say.
SpongeBob SquarePants seems like pure fun, but beneath the jokes lies something tragic. Some episodes aren't just silly, they're devastating. Betrayal, obsession, and heartbreak hide in plain sight. And today, we're diving into the most heartbreaking lore of all, one that changes everything you thought you knew. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's get into it. The episode begins with Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob leaving the Krusty Krab late at night. Mr. Krabs casually brags about 15 years of winning against Plankton in their weekly card game, but the next morning, everything changes. Mr. Krabs arrives at the Krusty Krab, but this time, he's in tears. SpongeBob, excited, asks how the game went, but Mr. Krabs mutters, "I lost." SpongeBob, confused, asks, "How much money did you lose?" Mr. Krabs looks at him, eyes filled with regret. "I didn't lose money. I lost you." It turns out Mr. Krabs bet SpongeBob's work contract and lost. SpongeBob laughs, thinking it's a joke, and tries to walk inside. But before he can step in, Mr. Krabs stops him. "You don't work here anymore." SpongeBob freezes. Before he can process it, Plankton arrives, grinning. He slaps a chum bucket helmet on SpongeBob's head and cackles. SpongeBob starts crying and clings to Mr. Krabs, but Mr. Krabs does nothing. Then Plankton throws him into a cage and flies him to the chum bucket. SpongeBob lands in a dark, empty room. Moments later, being scared, Plankton enters. "It's time, SpongeBob. Make me a Krabby Patty." SpongeBob, still shaken, doesn't move. Plankton narrows his eyes. "If you refuse, I'll remove your brain and put it in my robot chef." SpongeBob, teary-eyed, stares at the stove.
The sign says kitchen, but my heart says jail.
He looks out the window at the dark, empty, Krusty Krab. His eyes fill with tears and he starts singing.
A stove is a stove.
Back at the Krusty Krab, Mr. Krabs hears SpongeBob's voice and softly joins in.
What I say.
Two voices, separated by walls but feeling the same pain. Plankton, watching SpongeBob through a monitor, loses patience. He showers SpongeBob with affection, gifts, even an exact replica of the Krusty Krab's kitchen, but nothing works. SpongeBob doesn't need comfort. He just wants to go home. Desperate, Plankton tries one last time. "SpongeBob, make me a Krabby Patty." SpongeBob shrugs. "Hey, I don't feel like it." Plankton snaps. If SpongeBob won't cook, then he won't need a brain. He steals SpongeBob's brain and places it inside his robot chef. "Now, make me a Krabby Patty." The robot chef processes the command and then responds, "Why don't you ask me later?" Plankton loses his mind. Meanwhile, Mr. Krabs prepares to close the Krusty Krab for good. Then, Plankton bursts in, completely defeated. "Take him back! I can't do this anymore!" Mr. Krabs smirks. "I'll do it for $50. Plankton, too broken to argue, hands over the cash. Mr. Krabs takes it and throws Plankton back to the chum bucket. SpongeBob, now sporting a bandage on his forehead, blinks. Mr. Krabs doesn't hesitate. "All right, back to work." SpongeBob pauses. Then, eerily calm, he says, "Ask me later." Silence, then suddenly, he laughs. "Just kidding, I'll work for free today." Mr. Krabs, smug as ever, leans back. "I figured that's what you'd say." And just like that, everything goes back to normal, using SpongeBob for the one thing he is good at. "I figured that's what you'd say." This episode isn't just about SpongeBob being won in a card game. It's about betrayal, identity, and the crushing reality that no amount of love can change what you truly are to someone else. From the very start, SpongeBob has always worshipped Mr. Krabs. To him, the Krusty Krab isn't just a job. It's his home, his purpose, his entire identity. Every day he wakes up with boundless enthusiasm, ready to serve the man he admires most. And yet, in a single careless moment, Mr. Krabs throws all of that away. Not for money, not for power, but because he simply never thought twice about what SpongeBob meant to him. And that's what makes this episode so heartbreaking. SpongeBob doesn't fight back. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't even question why. He just breaks. Because for the first time, it dawns on him that maybe he was never as important to Mr. Krabs as Mr. Krabs was to him. Plankton, on the other hand, does everything he can to fill the void. He gives SpongeBob love, gifts, things Mr. Krabs never did. But none of it matters, because SpongeBob doesn't want gifts. He just wants to go home. No matter how much Plankton showers him with affection, SpongeBob can't cook. He can't function. Because his purpose was never about flipping patties, it was about doing it for Mr. Krabs. And that's the cruelest part of all. Mr. Krabs never deserved SpongeBob's loyalty, yet SpongeBob still refuses to exist without him. Even after being discarded, even after having his brain ripped out, even after realizing that his devotion is a one-way street, he still returns, still forgives, still serves. And what does Mr. Krabs do? Nothing. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't reflect. He doesn't even acknowledge what he did. He simply grins, takes SpongeBob back, and orders him to get back to work, because that's that's all SpongeBob has ever been to him. And SpongeBob laughs. He smiles, shakes it off, and pretends nothing ever happened. Because deep down, he knows the truth. He was never a person to Mr. Krabs. He was just another part of the restaurant. Replaceable, disposable. But if that's all he is, then he'll gladly be it. Because if being used means he gets to stay, then he'll let himself be used forever. And that's what makes this episode truly tragic. If you think this one was sad, wait till you have seen the next one. The episode begins with SpongeBob struggling to carry a heavy bag of snail food home for Gary. As he reaches his door, he notices a note. It says a package was delivered, but since he wasn't home, they'll re-deliver it later. Then the doorbell rings. Excited, SpongeBob opens the door and sees his package, sitting right on top of the bag of snail food. Overjoyed, he picks up the package, but in his excitement, he forgets the snail food outside. Inside the box is his Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy paddleball set, complete with a dirty bubble challenge. The goal?
29,998,559,671,349 times in a row!
Determined, SpongeBob immediately starts, but only manages to hit it once each time. Meanwhile, Gary walks to his food bowl. It's empty. Hungry, he meows for attention, but SpongeBob, completely fixated on his game, ignores him. Gary meows louder. SpongeBob, irritated, accuses him of trying to sabotage his challenge. Then, in a moment of frustration, he shoves Gary aside. Gary sighs. Feeling ignored, he packs his things and leaves. A bus pulls up. Gary boards it, leaving Bikini Bottom behind. Days pass. Patrick realizes he hasn't seen SpongeBob in a while and decides to check on him. When he arrives, he finds SpongeBob trembling in a corner. His bedroom? A complete disaster. Patrick, concerned, asks what's wrong. SpongeBob, barely holding it together, mutters that he's been doing the dirty bubble challenge. Trying to snap him out of it, Patrick takes SpongeBob to the kitchen for some milk. As they walk in, SpongeBob suddenly trips over Gary's food bowl. He pauses. Something feels off. Then it hits him. He rushes outside, grabs the bag of snail food, now completely covered in dust, and pours some into Gary's bowl. Then he calls for him, but Gary doesn't come. Confused, SpongeBob turns to Patrick. How long have I been doing the dirty bubble challenge? Patrick casually shrugs.
About a week.
A week?
SpongeBob's face turns pale, then full-blown panic. He races through the house, searching every room. Meanwhile, Gary is out in the middle of nowhere, starving, searching for a new home. Back at the house, SpongeBob frantically shakes a can of Gary's favorite treats, but still, nothing. Then he notices something in the mailbox. A letter from Gary. SpongeBob's hands tremble, and somehow Patrick makes him feel even guiltier. Meanwhile, Gary wanders into a new city. Starving, he spots a tray of nachos and moves in for a bite, until he sees dark shadows lurking nearby. His eyes widen. They're going to attack him. Panicked, he runs. But in reality, the snails weren't dangerous at all. After running for his life, Gary collapses. Then an old woman picks him up. There you are, my sweet little Miss Taffy. She hugs him tight, convinced he's her long-lost pet, and takes him home. Gary is immediately spoiled. Cookies, heated blankets, more affection than he's ever had. For the first time in days, he feels safe. The next day at the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob is completely broken, and as usual, Mr. Krabs doesn't care and tells him to just go to work. SpongeBob then convinces himself that he has to look harder and gets to work. He plasters the city with hundreds of flyers. At the same time, Gary and the old lady go shopping. Just as they step into a store, SpongeBob walks by hanging up flyers. Inside, Patrick also happens to be shopping. He casually passes Gary, says hi, and leaves. Gary steps toward the door, but just misses them. At this point, SpongeBob is completely lost. He even rents an airplane to write, "Come home, Gary," in the sky. Later that day, Gary lounges at home. The old lady drops a stack of flyers on the ground. Gary glances at them, then freezes. Every single flyer is from SpongeBob. His heart races. He immediately tries to leave, but as he opens a door, a pile of broken snail shells tumbles out. Gary stares in horror. The old lady slowly approaches. From inside a photo on the wall, the snails scream at him. "Run!" Gary launches himself into the air. The old lady hurls cookies at him, trying to stop him, but Gary barely dodges them. Sprinting through the streets, he spots one of the snails from before. Thinking fast, he shoves the snail onto the road, tricking the old lady into believing it's her lost pet. It works. Gary escapes. Back home, SpongeBob sits sadly on the couch, defeated. With a deep breath, he steps outside, looks up at a billboard, and screams in despair. At that moment, Gary appears next to him. Without a word, he climbs onto SpongeBob's head. SpongeBob slowly realizes what just happened. His eyes widen. Then, pure joy. He grabs Gary in the biggest hug imaginable, promising that things will be different from now on. Together, they head home. where SpongeBob finally gives Gary the meal he's been waiting for. At its core, this episode isn't just about SpongeBob forgetting to feed Gary. It's about neglect, obsession, and the painful realization that love alone isn't enough. SpongeBob loves Gary. To him, Gary isn't just a pet, he's family. But the moment SpongeBob gets wrapped up in something meaningless, that love takes a back seat. The Dirty Bubble Challenge becomes an obsession, blinding him to what actually matters. And Gary notices. He doesn't beg for attention, he doesn't throw a fit, he just waits. And when it becomes clear that SpongeBob won't remember, he leaves. Not out of spite, but because he has to. If he stays, he'll starve. SpongeBob is so consumed by his obsession that time barely exists for him. By the time Patrick finds him, he's already falling apart, unkempt, shaking, as if his entire world has collapsed. And in a way, it has. Because without realizing it, he abandoned the one thing that mattered most. By the time he snaps out of it, Gary is long gone. But SpongeBob refuses to accept that. Because if Gary is really gone, what does that say about him? That he let the one he loved the most slip away? Meanwhile, Gary finds himself in a warm, safe place. A soft bed, a full food bowl, everything he thought he wanted. But something feels off. Maybe it's the way the old woman holds him a little too tightly. Maybe it's the uneaten food piling up in the corner. And then he sees the flyers, hundreds of them. SpongeBob never stopped looking, never stopped calling, never gave up. That's when Gary understands. SpongeBob didn't stop loving him, he just got lost. But now, Gary is trapped. The old woman isn't a rescuer, she's a collector. And if Gary doesn't escape now, he never will. His escape is chaotic, desperate, messy, but he makes it because if there's even the smallest chance that SpongeBob is still waiting for him, he has to take it. And when he finally makes it home, there's no grand reunion, no dramatic moment, just Gary sitting on SpongeBob's head like nothing ever changed. Because maybe that's the lesson. Love isn't about grand gestures or big apologies, it's about being there, showing up every single day. This time, SpongeBob won't take that for granted. The episode starts with Squidward playing the piano on a deserted island. As he plays, he hears a bell ring every time he presses a key. He looks up and sees SpongeBob standing in front of him, ringing a bell. Suddenly, Squidward wakes up. It was just a dream. At the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob is waiting on Squidward excited. You know, like a dog waiting for his owner when he comes home. Mr. Krabs asked Squidward if he's ready to exchange gifts for Employee Brotherhood Day. Squidward, not interested at all, tells Mr. Krabs that he and SpongeBob will never be like brothers. SpongeBob then gives Squidward a hairy hoodie as a gift. It's super itchy, and SpongeBob happily explains that it's made of eyebrows. Grossed out, Squidward throws the hoodie back at him, making SpongeBob burst into tears. Seeing SpongeBob so upset, Mr. Krabs tells Squidward that he must make a gift for him too. Meanwhile, SpongeBob, still heartbroken, is now holding a hoodie made of his own tears, because he's super sad. Squidward heads to the kitchen to put something together when he spots a group of pirates outside the window, with pies. He walks over to them and asks if he can buy a pie. One of the pirates responds,
"Oh, these aren't homemade, they were made in a factory. A bomb factory. They're bombs." Oh.
But then the captain notices his money and quickly assures him they were just joking about the pie being a bomb.
Buy one.
Wait! We were just kidding about all that bomb stuff.
Squidward places the pie on Mr. Krabs' desk. Mr. Krabs picks up a slice and gets up to grab some milk. But as he walks, he trips, dropping the slice. The moment the slice hits, the entire Krusty Krab explodes, and Mr. Krabs and Squidward flying outside. Meanwhile, SpongeBob walks into the office, spots the pie on the desk with a card that says it's from Squidward, and takes it. Outside, Squidward explains the situation to Mr. Krabs. They rush inside, only to find the pie is gone. Then SpongeBob walks up, licking his fingers, and cheerfully thanks Squidward for the delicious pie. Mr. Krabs, horrified, turns to Squidward.
You had to kill him. The boy cries you sweater of tears, and you kill him.
Squidward freezes in panic. Desperate, he calls the hospital, but they tell him there's nothing they can do. Mr. Krabs grimly informs him that SpongeBob probably only has until sunset.
Tell him that'll only make him feel worse. The way I see it, he's only got until sunset.
Overcome with guilt, Squidward decides to give SpongeBob his best day ever before he dies. He tells SpongeBob that his gift has a part 2 and asks what he wants to do. SpongeBob excitedly pulls out a long list of activities. Squidward, regretting everything, sighs and agrees to do every single one. SpongeBob's first wish is to show off his best friend, Squidward, to everyone in town. They spend the entire day going around Bikini Bottom as SpongeBob proudly introduces Squidward to every single person they meet. Then, they move on to the next item on the list, showing off Squidward again, but this time in a salmon costume. They keep going down the list, knock-knock jokes. Walking backward, creating imaginative art, pretending Squidward has SpongeBob's face, performing surgery on Squidward, and finally watching the sunset together, the exact moment SpongeBob is supposed to explode. As the sun begins to set, they lie down to watch, separated by a wall Squidward built to protect himself from the explosion. SpongeBob starts burping from the pie he ate, and they begin counting down to sunset. Squidward counts down, hears a loud bang, and immediately starts crying with snot. Then, out of nowhere, there is another loud bang, and SpongeBob pops up, making bang noises, blowing bubbles with his bubble set. Squidward is shocked but also furious, and he screams that he's been waiting this whole time for SpongeBob to explode because of the pie. Without a care in the world, SpongeBob casually reaches into his pocket and pulls out the pie. Turns out he saved it so they could eat it together, but as he wants to give it to Octo, he trips. The pie flies straight into Squidward's face, and with that, all of Bikini Bottom explodes. And now it all makes sense. This episode isn't just about a pie, it's about Squidward's biggest tragedy. He doesn't realize he's lonely without SpongeBob until it's too late. Squidward has spent his entire life pushing SpongeBob away. He scoffs at his kindness, rolls his eyes at his affection, and convinces himself that SpongeBob is nothing more than an annoying pest. But when he suddenly believes he has doomed SpongeBob forever, something inside him breaks. He spends the day giving SpongeBob everything he ever wanted, not out of love, but out of guilt. But as the hours pass, something strange happens. For the first time in his life, Squidward stops fighting. He lets SpongeBob parade him around town, lets himself laugh at his dumb jokes, lets himself enjoy his company. And for a moment, a single fleeting moment, Squidward experiences what it's like to not be alone. But that's the cruelty of it all. The moment he realizes what SpongeBob means to him is the moment he thinks he's about to lose him forever. And just like that, it's all ripped away. SpongeBob was never in danger. The panic, the grief, the desperation, none of it was real, but the feelings were. Squidward's love was real, and that's what makes it so tragic. Because the second he lets his walls down, the universe reminds him that he will always be Squidward, alone, bitter, waiting for someone to love him back the way SpongeBob always has. But when that moment finally comes, it's already gone.